Alright, I did a video, must have been a few weeks ago, or a week and a half ago, and it was titled Why Truthers Hate the Fed. My thesis is that there are a lot of people who are libertarian, don't like the government, or who call themselves truthers. Why they don't like the Fed? One of the reasons that makes them so passionate about this issue is because they have financed, or they have made it easier to finance this military industrial complex, right? And that was what I was trying to get at. And if you look at some of the comments, Status I Cool, he clearly did not agree with what I was saying. So my thesis was that, hey, the Federal Reserve, what they're able to do, they're able to keep interest rates below the market rate. And when you do that, you are able to, number one, spend and borrow more than you otherwise would have, which allows for more welfare program spending and more spending on other programs as well, and that includes the military state, right? Whether you like the welfare or warfare state, that's not the issue. What we do have for sure is that when you have an elastic currency, right? We could look at what an elastic currency is, right? This is what you learned in college if you took some econ classes, which I did, right? Right, this is at AEI or AEI.org, conservative think tank website. And it just looks at a few concepts, right? At the founding of the Federal Reserve in 1913, the key point was neither stable prices nor employment. It was rather to create what they called an elastic currency. An act to provide for establish a Federal Reserve banks to furnish an elastic currency, right? That's what they say. That means to print currency, expand credit when it is needed, especially in times of credit crises and panics, right? So this is the number one intent that they talked about, saying that, hey, if you have elastic currency, you could live beyond your means. We can help these mega banks that lend too much, and because of the scam of fractional reserve banking, we don't need to have the banking panics of the 1800s, right? But the unintended consequences of this is you could spend more on welfare, right? Just as the Paul Krugmanites talk about, right? But what else could you spend more on, right? You could spend more on military. I mean, if you expand a rubber band, right? You could, number one, stretch it out, right? And we are stretching out our budget, our spending with this Federal Reserve. And we don't need to tax to go to war. Because how many people would be against wars if we actually had to have a tax? We have a hidden tax called inflation, right? That's what you learned if you read the book The Creature from Jekyll Island. But anyways, let's look at more of the data from the 1900s and 1800s. Alright, and here's the interesting part for these wars, right? If you look at the major wars of the United States, you could see American Revolution cost $101 million. And today, that would cost $2.4 billion. Right? War of 1812, $90 million. It'd be $1.5 billion. Mexican War, 71 million, and then it came out to, I don't know, 2.3 billion. This goes on and on. And the most expensive war during that time frame was the Civil War, right? And you have to remember the Civil War, that was the time where, number one, you had the United States come off the gold standard, and that's when they were able to finance the war via, number one, the greenbacks, which I mentioned before. And then the Confederates also founded their wars via paper money as well. You just want to look at a few facts. The war costs per GDP in the year of the war. You could see that the most expensive war was the Civil War, right? 11.3%. So that was the 19th century wars, right? And as you can see that these wars you didn't see that much discrepancy in the costs from the American Revolution up until, you could say, the Mexican War. But if you want to look at contrast, right? Look at the wars starting in, I don't know, right after the Federal Reserve was created. Look at the total cost of the war, right? $20 billion, right? And you have to remember, $1 technically would have been the same as like 1793, right? The equivalent of the dollar stayed the same until the Federal Reserve decided to debase the currency, right? We've lost 98% of our purchasing power since 1913. And if you wanted to look at the total amount of deaths, right? There were 8 million people, 8 to 9 million people that died. War costs per GDP in peak of war, 13.6%. Total defense percentage GDP in the peak year of war, 14.1%. That's huge, right? And then if you want to look at World War II, right? Another expensive war, $296 billion, which today would be roughly more than $4 trillion, right? Okay? And we did get off the gold standard to fight that as well. War costs, percentage-wise, GDP in peak year of war, 35.8%. Total defense percentage GDP in peak of war, 37.5%. And my thesis is, once you got off hard money, you could say you got off hard money in, 1913, you tend to spend more on wars, and it leads to more death and destruction than you otherwise would have. I mentioned the concept of an elastic currency, right? You could spend more than you otherwise could have because of keeping interest rates below the market rate. So for all intents and purposes, you had hard money, right? Or you were in a hard money paradigm. You had no Fed. I mean, sure, you had the gold standard in 1914, right? You still had it. You didn't technically get off it until 1971, but it wasn't the classical gold standard. Long story short, if you had a hard money system, had interest rates at the market rate, would have been able to finance World War I to the extent that they did. Would they be able to finance $20 billion worth? Yes or no? Right? Doesn't matter if you like the Fed or not. Answer that simple question. And World War II, right? $296 billion. Answer this question. If they had higher interest rates, right? In my opinion, not in my opinion, I think they capped 30-year like close to 2%, something ridiculously low. Would it have been possible for the Federal Reserve to finance $296 billion during that time frame from 1941 to 1945 if they kept interest rates at the market rate? Yes or no? Answer that question. Would it have been possible for roughly, I don't know, was it 80 to 90 million people that died? Let me check it out. So the amount of people that died during World War II was somewhere between 60 to 85 million people. So I want all of you to think about this. If you had a Federal Reserve, if you had no Fed, right, you had interest rates at the market rate, would it have been possible to have 60 to 80 million people die prematurely? Yes or no? And my answer would be definitely no. And my reasoning is because what would happen is if you had no Fed, they would have to finance this war most likely through higher taxes, right? And the people would revolt. And not to say that if you have a gold standard paradigm that you won't have a war. You're always going to have conflicts, no doubt about that. But the fact is that you're going to have, most likely, more people die during these wars. Now, that being said, you have to look at what happened after World War II, right? I mean, there were some rules set in place that it not made it harder to fight wars, but there were no superpowers after World War II. America was the only superpower, and the Soviets, you could say, threatened them, right? Or they were their enemy, right? And you have to also ask yourself this question. Would we have spent all this money on the Cold War and having all these nukes in Russia and all across the world, which could actually create a lot of problems down the road. Would it have been possible for both of these countries to build up their nuclear arsenal if you had no Fed? What would happen then? Would they spend all this money on nukes? In my response, the answer would be no. And this is what the Paul Krugmanites, right? These individuals will not tell you, right? They always will tell you that World War II got you out of the Depression and the warfare state. They're not saying this directly, but they cheerlead more central banking policies, or they champion policies of World War II because it got us out of the Depression, right? They're always defending that warfare state. In fact, they usually bash the warfare state, but when it comes to World War II, they say that war stimulates aggregate demand, and that's what got us out of the Depression. But if you tell them, hey, guess what? A lot of people died during that process, and we blew up the rest of the world, and that's what got us out of the Depression, right? Then they get defensive, or they get really mad when you mention that fact. It's always interesting to bring up these fun tidbits to these guys, but hey, people are going to disagree with you, and that's a good thing. You could always have a civil dialogue, and hopefully you can learn more out of it. Anyways, guys, thanks for listening to me, and I'm going to cover this Krugman argument about World War II, which is really bizarre to see a lot of people champion the idea of World War II getting us out of the Depression, right? And then they always say that, hey, war was great, but if you look at it, a lot of people had to die, and there's a military draft on top of it. And that's why I always despise guys like Krugman whenever he brings that up. And a lot of people who regurgitate that statement from him and Stiglitz and all these other Nobel Prize winning economists from the left. Anyways, thanks for listening to me, guys. Talk to you later. Bye.